As Dean of Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government, it's my honor to open this first symposium of these 350th anniversary celebrations and to welcome His Excellency Sheikh Ahmed Zaki Yamadi to Harvard today. To introduce Sheikh Yamadi and to moderate this symposium, let me introduce the director of the school's Energy and Environmental Policy Center, Professor Bill Hogan. A former director of analysis for the Energy Department of the U.S. government, Bill has served as professor and director of the school's Energy and Environment Center over the past 8 years and is an authority on the subject of oil, energy, and the environment. So, Bill Hogan.
Thank you, Graham. Let me add my own welcome to Madam Himani, and as well as the alumni and friends of Harvard at this celebration of our 350th anniversary and, of course, the 50th anniversary of the Kennedy School. Harvard measures its time in decades, and thus the university's Energy and Environmental Policy Center is a much more recent addition. However, we have benefited from the work of our predecessors, especially A.J. Meyer, who was instrumental in focusing attention on energy problems long before it was fashionable, and was an old friend of Sheikh Yamadi before A.J. passed away. This event is the first of the symposia to be held here in the ARCO Forum in the Kennedy School as part of the celebrations, and is also the first symposium under the auspices of the A.J. Meyer Foundation. A word on format before I introduce our speaker. There will be an initial presentation and subsequently a question period. In order to facilitate questions, you've been provided forms in your packets to write out questions. If you would give those to the marshals, they'll collect them for me, and later as the moderator, I'll try to find a range of issues representative of those raised by this large audience. It's a great pleasure and an honor to welcome His Excellency Ahmed Zaki Himani, Minister of Petroleum and Mineral Resources of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. As you can see from your program, in addition to the 350th and 50th anniversaries, this is the 30th anniversary of Minister Yamadi's degree from the Harvard Law School. During the 3 decades since, His Excellency has been a loyal son of Harvard and a supporter of energy research. In addition to the late Professor Meyer's seminars, I recall with favor that he spoke at Harvard's Dunbarton Oak Conference of 1979 on the occasion of the publication of Energy Future. The subject of the conference then was on energy security and the role of conservation. As you will remember, the world oil market was in turmoil at the time. Minister Yamadi presented a challenging analysis that greatly improved that symposium. Researchers here at the Energy and Environmental Policy Center have continued to address the problems of energy security. As an American, it is easy for me to slip into a particularly American perspective that misses important dimensions of international energy problems. Minister Yamadi has been the most articulate spokesman of a broader vision that emphasizes mutual security and reciprocity. In part, his vision comes from his own philosophical perspective as a scholar who has dwelt on the connection between Islamic law and contemporary issues. He once said, "Nearly all the evils that plague the modern world in its business and trading activities were tackled a very long time ago. The way they were handled by various truly Islamic rulers and judges reveals a sophistication that is hard to improve even in modern days." This historical and philosophical bent of mind has been tested in an unparalleled career as a principal actor at center stage in the tumultuous development of the world oil market. In 1956, when Sheikh Yamadi returned to Saudi Arabia, OPEC did not exist. The Texas Railroad Commission was the principal organization for managing oil production and setting prices, and Saudi Arabia produced only 5% of the world's oil output. During the 30 years that passed, as His Excellency took up the full challenges before him, Saudi Arabia's production increased as much as tenfold, its market share tripled, and it became a focal point of energy markets. Sheikh Yamadi began as a legal advisor to the Council of Ministers in Saudi Arabia. In 1962, he was appointed to his current position. He is now the director or chairman of the board of a wide variety of organizations concerned with the development of industry and resources in Saudi Arabia. In 1968 through 69, he served as Secretary General of the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries. His Excellency has been recognized with honorary degrees on at least 4 continents. For those of us who study the world oil market, Minister Yamadi has been the premier analyst, diplomat, and businessman. The Quran teaches that we charge not any soul save to its ability. Minister Yamadi has been blessed with great ability. He has given like measure in return. Today we can benefit as he reflects on his personal observations over a period of unprecedented experience to comment on oil markets past, present, and future. Please join me in greeting an alumnus of whom Harvard is very proud, His Excellency Sheikh Ahmed Zaki Yamani.
Thank you, Professor. I assure you the only thing I'm proud of is to be a graduate of this university 30 years ago. Anything else was just the fruits of that fact. And the subject you have chosen for me is a very difficult one. It is not difficult to talk about the past. It is known to you. It's not difficult to talk about the present. You can simply say it is chaos. But to talk about the future is a very difficult task. Saudi Arabia is not the only player now. There are so many contradicting forces in that area. Some political forces as well. And it is very difficult to know what will happen, but let us try together, and probably during the questions and answers we can get a better light on the future. But as we all remember, when crude oil prices started to rise in 73, 74, there was a furor reaction in consuming countries. It was described as shocking, disturbing, causing inflation, stagnation, and so on. That reaction was even much stronger when prices started to rise again in the 79-81 period. It was called the second oil shock. I'm not here to examine the validity at this stage of those accusations, but I want to tell you that Saudi Arabia considers itself as a part of the free world. We believe in free enterprises and the forces of supply and demand. We also believe that oil is a special commodity. It has to be supplied to consumers without interruption. And therefore, its price should be set at a level that fulfills this objective. Understating or overstating the price level could lead to short-term or even long-term supply disruption. And as a person who always observes what the media reports about OPEC, I'm not really astonished to find that OPEC is again attacked for the present third oil shock. It was said that what's happening today was engineered by OPEC or probably by some of the OPEC members, with all the accusation against us. Ladies and gentlemen, I find the appellation oil price collapse somewhat strange. It is true that prices went down, but I think it already escaped a total collapse. Probably a collapse may not happen at all. Let's hope for that. Although consuming countries can now import oil at bargain prices, the effect of such cheap oil on their economies tend to be ignored. The consuming countries charge, or at least some of them, that cheap prices have a negative impact on indigenous production of energy, be it oil, coal, gas, or nuclear. Low prices, they say, do not provide sufficient incentive for exploration and development of local reserves. And therefore, we hear about some voices calling for import restrictions. Those import restrictions, if adopted, can have adverse effect on friends as well as on those who are called adversaries. In addition to the negative effect such restrictions might have on world trade, they would in fact also hurt more directly those big oil exporters whose supplies are more or less considered secure, either because those exporters are neighboring countries or because they are countries classified as traditional trading partners. Countries like Mexico, Canada, Venezuela, the United Kingdom, Norway, and even Russia account for a big share in the imports of industrialized countries. Thus, the advocates of trade barriers on oil, in order to avoid hurting those countries, modified their scheme, proposing a kind of selective applicability of trade barriers that would exempt those countries from their effects, although they must know full well that discrimination in world trade provokes retaliatory measures, which can lead to trade wars and spell the end of free trade practices. It might also force the producers to go back to the previous level of prices, no matter what the sacrifices will be. The truth of the matter is that prices have fluctuated considerably in the past 16 years, from a level of $1.80 per barrel in the 60s. They were increased to a range of $10.84 to $12.70 in the period of 74-78. Between 79 and 82, they ranged from $18 per barrel to $34 per barrel, the latter price reflecting their peak. They commenced their downward slide in 83-85 with a range of $29 to $28 per barrel. In January 86, they dropped sharply down to $82 per barrel. And they continued moving down in leaps and bounds until they reached another of $9 per barrel. And that's in July 86. They have been recently restored to about $14 to $15 per barrel. Ladies and gentlemen, such fluctuations have caused tremendous instability in the world market. This instability is the underlying cause of discontent among both producers and consumers. For the producers, it underscores their dependence on residual world demand and the upward or downward movement of that demand under the coordinated guidance of the consuming countries. Residual demand determines the export volume of those producers and hence largely their export revenues. For the consumers, such fluctuations emphasize their need for imports, the cost involved in such imports, and the opportunity cost of substituting those imports with domestic energy sources. Neither party can plan with confidence for long-term energy production, investments, and consumption. Nor can they allocate and mix resources in such a way as to achieve economic objectives with optimum efficiency. It is clear, therefore, that what the oil industry badly needs is price stability in the long term. But before introducing any proposition in this regard, I consider it important to recall the events of the past 26 years, with a view of throwing some light on the evolution of world oil prices and their structure. In the 20 years from 1950 to 1970, mainstream crude oil prices in the Arabian Gulf were fixed by the oil companies at a level that ranged between $1.75 to $1.95 per barrel. This level was raised for a while in 1957 to about $2.08 in the wake of the Suez Canal closure, which followed the invasion of Egypt by the three forces, France, United Kingdom, and Israel. However, that price level was reduced again to $1.90 in February '59 and again in August 1960 to $1.75. This was even against the protest of the oil producers and Saudi Arabia in the beginning. We tried with the oil companies and they refused to raise the price. Their argument was always the same, namely that product prices in the market do not permit a net back value FOB price of export greater than $1.80 per barrel. And sometime in May 1970, a certain event took place which nullified such contention. During that month, the crude pipeline, which we call TAP line, between Saudi Arabia and Sidon in Lebanon, was accidentally damaged. The oil flow running through that pipeline at a rate of 470,000 barrels per day was suspended until January 29, 1971. On January 30th, the oil started to flow, but at a lower level of 382,000 barrels a day. During this period of supply disruption from the pipeline, product prices in world market firmed up considerably. Toward the end of June 1970, 2 months after the pipeline was shut down, all kinds of products, gasoline, kerosene, fuel oil, and so on, went up, and In per barrel terms, the increase averaged to $1.25, which is about 40% higher than the CIF prices in the Middle East crudes to West Europe. Oil companies, however, decided to increase East Mediterranean prices by 20 cents only, which is about 9.2%. We in OPEC got together and felt that we have to ask for a much higher price. We met in Caracas in December 1970, and that was a very important turning point in the history of the oil industry. We decided to seek an increase in income tax from 50% to 55%, and to ask for an increase in the price of oil, and to eliminate most of the allowances that the oil companies used to cut from and use as expenses, like marketing allowances and so on. As I said, that conference was a turning point in the history of oil pricing. It paved the way for the ensuing negotiations with the oil companies. And in Tehran, during February 1971, we reached an agreement with the oil companies to raise prices by 38 cents per barrel and to accept an increase in income tax rate from 50% to 55%, and for the future to apply an annual increase in the price of 2.5%, in addition to 5 cents per barrel as a lump sum to be added annually until 1975. Then after that, we had some small increases due to the devaluation in the value of the dollar. As you know, we price our oil in dollars, and then we decided to use a basket. And we had two agreements, Geneva I and Geneva II, which increased slightly the value of, or the price of our crudes. But we were not satisfied. The market justifies a much higher price than that. And we asked the oil companies to meet again and start some negotiations. We met with them in September 73 without any successful results, and we had to meet in October in Vienna next month. We met, that was immediately after the October War between Egypt and Israel. For one reason or another, the oil companies felt that it is better for them not to act as a buffer element between the producers and the consumers, and they made it very difficult to continue negotiations with us, and they put all kinds of obstacles in our way to negotiate with them. On the 16th of October of that year, we met in Kuwait and decided to take into our hands as OPEC the right to price our oil. We decided then to increase our posted prices to $5.12 for the Arab Light, which became since then the so-called marker crude price. That increase was about 70% relative to the prevailing prices at that time. And since then, we started a direct conflict with the consumers, producers versus consumers. OPEC began to set the international prices of crude oil as well in January 74. The posted price was increased to $11 I never forget those days in Tehran. The spot price in Rotterdam went up to $23, and the Shah of Iran insisted that prices should be in that range. And we in Saudi Arabia thought it would be too high, and it was a very serious battle. But we increased it to $10.84 with a 93% ratio of market price to posted price. By the end of '78, crude oil market prices moved up a little to reach $12.70 per barrel. The big rise came in June 1979, when the price of Arabian Light reached $18 per barrel. In November of that year, it reached $24 per barrel and continued to increase thereafter until it peaked to $34 per barrel in October '81. In March '83, OPEC met in London and decided to reduce the price of oil to $29 per barrel. And the organization again adjusted that price and reduced it by $1 in January '85 in a move to modify price differentials. In December '85, OPEC decided to secure a fair share for its output and exports in a bid to increase its production, which in reality OPEC decided to abandon its role to determine the price of oil and to adopt a market-oriented price system. That decision marked the first time since '73 that OPEC had ceased to be the price setter of international oil prices. As a matter of fact, if you go back to the history of the oil industry, oil was always priced by somebody. In the beginning, it was the oil companies, and then it was OPEC, and now the market took over that role. And prices declined from about $22 per barrel in January '86 to $9 per barrel in July this year. OPEC had unilaterally assumed control over crude oil pricing in order to rectify the anomaly of underpricing adopted by the oil companies during the '60s. It is quite obvious that a price of $1.80 per barrel, a price which remained static for 10 years, certainly did not reflect the supply-demand relationship during that period, where demand increased at an annual rate of 7.7% in the period of 1960-1970, from a level of 18.6 million barrels per day to a level of 39 million barrels per day. At the same time, OPEC supplies increased at a higher rate of 10.7% annually, as other non-OPEC supplies retreated in volume. Cumulative production of OPEC during that period reached close to 60 billion barrels. Such depletion of OPEC reserves had the effect of reducing the reserves to production ratio in OPEC countries from 68.8 in 1960 to 47.1 in 1970. Despite the growth of their reserves from 218.2 billion barrels in 1960 to 407 billion barrels by the end of 1970. If such depletion rates had continued, the reserves to production ratio would have reached a very critical level of 38 in 1977. The price increases which took place in the aftermath of the Tehran Agreement were not sufficiently high enough to check the growth of demand in the world market. In August 73, the price of Arabian Light reached a level of $3.14 per barrel, which was 74.4% higher than the pre-Tehran price. Demand in 1973, however, reached 47.4 million barrels per day, which was 21.5% higher. In January 74, prices were raised to a level of $11.65 per barrel. Subsequently, during 74 and 75, demand somewhat declined, and it resumed its traditional growth in 1976 through 79, but at a much slower pace. In 1979, it peaked at all-time high to 50.9 million barrels per day, which reflected a rise of only 9.5% over the 73 level. Thus, it grew in a period of 6 years at a rate equivalent to that of only 1 year's growth in the 70s. The underlying growth rate over the period 73-79 amounted only to 1.3% per annum, a pronounced slowdown from more than 7% average rate which had prevailed in the period of 1960-73. OPEC supplies suffered similar stagnation over the same period. In 73, they amounted to 31 million barrels per day, virtually the same level they attained in 1979. In the years between 73 and 79, namely 74 through 78, OPEC supplies have varied between a low of 27.7 million barrels per day in 75 and a high of 31.2 million barrels per day in 1977, close to the levels reached in 73 and 79 on the average. In other words, OPEC supplies in the entire period of 73-79 stagnated. Total world supplies during that period had exceeded demand by a small margin of only about 7%, indicating that a state of virtual equilibrium had been reached between supply and demand. Further evidence of that equilibrium is provided by the fact that the oil price, which was set at a level of $11.75 in early 74, had grown only slightly to a level of $14.55 per barrel by May 79. This balanced supply-demand situation at prevailing prices signaled the fact that additional price increases of sizable magnitude would disturb the balance by generating a decline in consumption coupled with an oversupply situation. But such a perception was ironically denied. OPEC in 79, being concealed by the concurrent rise in demand by oil companies for stockpiling and by consuming countries apprehensive about their supply security due to the sharp decline in Iranian production by about 3.7 million barrels per day, they started buying. Hence, the scrambling for immediate purchases of crude oil at rising prices. This drive had the effect of raising demand for OPEC oil in 79 to close to 31 million barrels per day. But even in normal circumstances, even if that stockpiling drive had not taken place, demand for OPEC oil might still have reached about 29 million barrels per day. But the steep rise served to create a dangerously false impression, namely that however high the price, there would be a number of buyers more than willing to pay it. Prices in the spot market reached or exceeded $40 per barrel. In this situation, it naturally seemed to OPEC that to ask for $34 per barrel for its crude exports was not unreasonable. Unfortunately, we were lonely inside OPEC at that time. We kept telling them that this is a false anomaly, that it is very dangerous to raise the price of oil. They used to raise their prices, and we stay $4 or $5 below that price, and with all kinds of pressures we have to move up in order to make a compromise with them. Once we move, they move again, and so on. Well, when OPEC supplies started to decline sharply in 81 and 82 as a result of the fall of demand and the rise in non-OPEC supplies, we recognized too late that oil was overpriced, that it had reached a high level, destroying the state of virtual equilibrium between supply and demand, which prevailed for so long. However, Saudi Arabia, which in the past had used its production as a tool for restricting the trend toward increases of prices, now reversed its position by reducing production in order to support the revenues in the short term. It would be economically logical for OPEC to place a ceiling on its production, and by so doing to consolidate the price level, first at $38 per barrel, then at 29, and then at $28 per barrel in 85. However, the hopes previously harbored by OPEC member countries of reversing the downward trend in their production share in a steadily declining oil market had faded away. Demand for OPEC oil continued its decline, stagnating at a level of 11% below its previous peak, whereas non-OPEC supplies increased by about 5.7 million barrels per day from their 79 level. Ladies and gentlemen, since 81, OPEC has been calling for a modus operandi with non-OPEC exporters. With the exception of Mexico, these pleas have fallen on deaf ears. The share of OPEC production in total world supplies in 85 declined to an unacceptable level of 15 million barrels and a half per day. It became clear that OPEC, with such a low level of production, could no longer continue to bear the whole weight of supporting the price structure. It simply lacked the power to do so. Neither could Saudi Arabia, whose production level reached about 2 million barrels per day in July 85, adhere any longer to the fixed price system if it was to realize the revenue needed for its budget, to feed its population, and to finance its economic development. As a result, OPEC decided during a meeting in December 85 to secure and defend for itself a fair share in the world oil market. This was achieved with remarkable success. During the first 7 months in 86, the combined production of its member exceeded 17.5 million barrels per day, reflecting a rise of 12.5%. And that was a historical decision, as I said before. The sharp decline in world crude oil prices, which commenced in '86, has had varying degrees of impact on the countries of the world. Oil producers, whether inside or outside OPEC, have lost huge amounts in oil revenues. Should the price average reach about $14 during this year, OPEC countries' net government revenues may amount to $65.3 billion. If it goes to up to $15 per barrel, it might go up to $70.7 billion. Revenues under the first case may therefore represent a decline of 44.3% from their earnings in '85. And in the second case, it's a decline of 41.9%. The export earnings of OPEC peaked, as it is known, to $282 billion in 1980. But in '81 started the decline. Non-OPEC countries may also suffer similar decline. Egypt, for instance, may experience a decline of about 58%, while the United Kingdom may lose about $8 billion in government revenues. Consuming countries, on the other hand, may enjoy a great deal of savings in their import bills. For instance, it is estimated that the United States oil imports value in '86 may amount to $28.9 billion at an average CIF price of $16 per barrel. We assume $1 for freight. And a net import volume of 4.9 million barrels per day. This represents a decline in import expenditure from '85 of 33% and a drop of 57% compared with 1980. West Europe, of course excluding United Kingdom and Norway, is expected to spend about $57 billion on oil imports during '86, at an average price of $15 per barrel, which reflects a saving of $45 billion from the value of '85, reached about $53 billion. That figure is based on a net import value of 5.3 million barrels per day and an average CIF price of $27.4 per barrel. In '86, it is estimated that those imports at an average CIF price of $15 may fall to $29 billion, reflecting a decline of 45.3%. These savings will certainly have a positive effect on the balance of payments of industrialized countries in 1986. If the trend to low prices continue for a few years, it would have a sustained positive effect on GDP, inflation, and employment. However, a negative impact on the economies of the countries may be indirectly felt by the slum in their exports to OPEC countries. We used to export at a very high price, and we expect to come down to no more than 29.9 billion barrels from the high level which we reached in 1980. Ladies and gentlemen, OPEC charged high prices for its crude during 79-81 period for the reasons already explained. These high prices were sustained for 4 more years until the end of 85. The outcome of such high price level was that it created an imbalance between supply and demand, which worked to the disadvantage of OPEC in the intermediate term. Non-OPEC supplies, be they oil, coal, gas, or nuclear, have been stimulated to an extent which made it possible for them to capture a sizable share of OPEC oil exports. OPEC, in order to arrest the declining trend in oil prices, which permeated the market as a result, resorted to measures of supply control involving the reduction of its production at first voluntarily during 81-82 and then by a decision to have a ceiling thereafter. Consequently, as supply-demand gap narrows, prices will tend to firm up and also to increase. It is very important for the world oil industry to seek equilibrium in the long term if it is to achieve stability, a goal desired by both producers and consumers. In order to achieve stability, price setters should be able to interpret supply-demand factors in such a way as to determine the prices at levels that achieve long-term equilibrium. I feel sometimes very sad when I hear that the law of supply and demand dictates on us to leave the price of oil decided in the market. We think that we have to take that law for a period of not only a month or two, a year or two, for a much longer period. Failure to do so will create cyclical upheaval for exporters and importers, probably as early as the 90s, similar to those experienced in the last 26 years. The time is now opportune for adopting policies aimed at avoiding the mistakes of the past. There were times of underpricing in the 60s and times of overpricing in the 80s. The 70s, in my opinion, contrary to the belief of so many people, had in general a period of equilibrium and stability. If a period of 13 years is taken to represent the long term, and assuming that this period begins in 1980 and ends in 92, then it is foreseen that a price range that achieves equilibrium between supply and demand in world market may, during this period, fall between the peak price of $34 per barrel in 81 and the low price of $14 per barrel, which may prevail in 1986. Should the price climb in 87 and the following years at a rate of $1 per annum, so as to reach $20 per barrel in 92, it is calculated that the price which may emerge on the weighted basis for the period of 1980-92 will be about $23.8 per barrel. It is assumed that during this period, world demand may grow at a rate of 1.5% per annum through 1992, so that by that year it would reach about 90.9 million barrels per day. At such level, world potential supply, which may stagnate more or less at about 55 million barrels per day, would exceed demand by only 8%. This situation would have the effect of narrowing down the prevailing supply-demand disequilibrium to manageable proportions. Thus, looking at the problem from the standpoint of long-term equilibrium, it is assumed that if OPEC in 1980 had charged a price of $23.8 per barrel and had kept it frozen at the same level for the 12-year period of 81-92, OPEC countries would thereby earn an amount of revenue over the entire period equivalent to that actually earned in the period of 1980-85 together, with the amount supposedly to be earned over the period of 86-92, under an average price of $18 per barrel. It may be inferred from this that the average price of $18 per barrel, if applied in the intermediate term, it will be the price which may reflect equilibrium in the intermediate term and makes it possible for equilibrium to be arrived at in the long term, as well at a price of $23.8 per barrel. Under such supply-demand price scenario, OPEC countries' exports are foreseen to increase from 14.9 million barrels per day in 86 to 20 million barrels per day in 1992. As a result, their revenue is expected to reach $146 billion in 1992, roughly the same as the amount they earned in 84. It is further assumed that if the price charged by OPEC for the entire period of 1980-92 remained at a level of $23.8, where demand would have moderated its fall perhaps by 50%, instead of reaching the low level of 45 million barrels per day in the early 80s, it could have declined modestly to about 48 to 49 million barrels per day from its peak of 51 million barrels per day in 79. Furthermore, non-OPEC supplies, which were so strongly induced at a price range of $30 to $34 per barrel, would, at a price of $23.8, have been maximized at a level of 1 to 2 million barrels per day, below the peak of 23 million barrels per day reached in 1985. Under such assumptions, it is calculated that world demand for OPEC supplies would have been stabilized at a level of about 20 to 22 million barrels per day for the entire period of 1981-92, rather than have fluctuated between 26 million barrels per day in 1980 and 15.6 million barrels per day in 85. As a result, OPEC's annual income would have been stabilized at about $153 billion rather than have fluctuated between a high of $282 billion in 1980 to a low of $76 billion in 86. Under both scenarios, therefore, from the revenue standpoint, OPEC would end up in the long term with the same situation. However, OPEC was overwhelmed by the market fluctuations, this resulting in the situation with which we are confronted today. if the market is to be stabilized in the long term, OPEC and non-OPEC producers should cooperate in aiming at the establishment of a price structure which takes into account the economics of equilibrium between supply and demand. Producers as well as consumers should adopt policies that shun drastic interference in the market forces which may disturb the much sought for long-term stability. It is only through achievement of long-term free market equilibrium that stability can be sustained. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sheikh Yamadi. Your analysis has given us a great deal of information to think about. If I might take the moderator's prerogative as we start to ask an initial question myself, your history describes one of instability and tension among the members of OPEC, and your prescription for the future calls for stability. If you read the Western press in the latest downturn, OPEC is dead and gone. How are you going to achieve the cohesion that you're talking about? How are you going to get the stability that you're looking for in OPEC in the future?
It's not easy. It's extremely difficult because so many members in OPEC will become so angry if they read what I have said right now. I don't think they believe in what we believe in. But I think the majority now is emerging to really look for stability and equilibrium in supply-demand.
If I could, a question from the audience. According to U.S. Data, Saudi exports in 1986 are up 40% over last year. However, the oil price is about half of last year's level, and revenues are down 20% or more. In what sense is Saudi Arabia better off compared to last year? And if not, why this strategy?
Well, it wasn't a strategy. We have a quota, or we had a quota of 4.35 million barrels a day. We consume 1 million barrels at home, and we export about 3.5 million barrels and earn our revenues from the exports only. Our level of production came down from the 4.3 to 2 million barrels a day. And we were positive that it will come down to 1 million barrels a day. That's the level of the local consumption. Because we were sticking to the fixed price of oil, while everybody else was free to do whatever he wants. So we had no choice. It was not a strategy. It's either to finance our budget and increase production, or just stay without any revenue, and that's a decision no government can take. So there was no strategy. We were forced to do that.
Thank you. Another question. Many independent oil companies are trying to get the U.S. government to impose an oil import tax to raise the price of oil and to save themselves from going out of business. It is not likely that this will happen, but if it did, would this provoke any particular reaction in OPEC?
I think I was talking about this, and I said that if you want to impose restrictions in form of import tariffs, what about Mexico, United Kingdom, Canada, Venezuela? Are you going to impose tariffs against them, your friends? And if you want to exempt them, then you are discriminating. And what is left? Well, there are so many other disadvantages, because your competitors in the OECD countries are not going to impose the same tariff. And if the energy cost for your manufactured goods to be exported worldwide will be much higher than the Japanese and the Germans, you will lose your market. And they will be able to invade you at home at a much stronger and higher level than what they're doing right now. So you have to think about it twice before you do it.
If I may, another question. You say that stability of price is a key objective. In 1978 through 79, you curbed Saudi production to hold the price up at that time because you said then that you hoped higher prices would encourage U.S. conservation, which in the long run would extend the life of your reserves. Would you today, if you had to do it again, have further increased your production then to moderate the reaction by consumers at that time? And if you had gone to 15 million barrels per day in 1979, would there have been a greater stability in the 80s?
He thinks that we curbed our production in 1978,
It says in
1979.
1978 and 79, you curbed Saudi production to hold the price up at that time.
That's news to me. In 1978, June 78, we discussed what should be the level of prices, of production. We did not decide on anything. That was a confidential meeting in OPEC, and we in Saudi Arabia said we will not come below 8.5 million barrels a day. So we did not curb our production, and this did not happen. In 79, instead, we raised our production. And in order to stop unnecessary increases in the price of oil, we pumped more than 10 million barrels a day. We annoyed our partners in OPEC, but that was our only tool to reduce their appetite for higher prices. So we did exactly the opposite.
Okay, a little change of pace here. During your tenure as oil minister, Saudi Arabia has made great strides domestically, which in turn have affected the culture and society in Saudi Arabia. Looking toward the end of the century, can you give us your thoughts on further changes which might take place and how the country will develop?
Well, I think we achieved the level of development in industry and infrastructure which we wanted to do. Luckily, before the decline in the price of oil. In the present 5 years plan, we focused not on development, but on maintaining the infrastructure which we already achieved. So I don't foresee any substantial change in the social or economical structure of the country for the coming 5 or 10 years.
If I may, just again to take the interlude away from oil prices just for a moment, since I have many oil price questions that we can come back to. In the context of the Kennedy School of Government, I think it's appropriate for me and as the chairman of the public policy program to ask you about government service. We have young people we're educating for public service, and one of the things we try to teach is the opportunity to make a difference, what the individual can do. As you look on your own career in Saudi Arabia, what would you offer your own observations on the impact that you and others can make as individuals in public service of your country?
I have to come back to give a speech for that.
Well, you're invited.
But you cannot have one rule. What is applicable in Saudi Arabia might not be the rule in the United States or in Europe or even in a neighboring country nearby Saudi Arabia. I think you have to take every individual case on its own merits. However, there will be some common rules which we can discuss, but I don't think we have the time to discuss that.
Well, then back to oil prices, a question here. If we adopted your plan and got to, let's say, $23 as an average price, the question, how long could the equilibrium at 23 last? Is this...
until 92.
Until
and then
92.
we have to look at something else thereafter.
Mm-hmm. Should there be...
It's $23.8 for the entire period.
Mm-hmm.
I hope this will be clear.
Should there be any relationship between the price of oil in the market and the production cost of oil? If so, what should the relationship be? And if not, why shouldn't there be a relationship?
Because you have countries with cost of production direct cost of $6 per barrel, indirect cost for another $6 or $7 per barrel. If you come to this country, cost of production might go up to $15 or so. And you have a cost of production in Saudi Arabia of $1 or even less. How are you going to deal with it? You price the Saudi crude at, let's say, $2, $3 and price the Omani Dubai crude or the North Sea, Norway crude at $15, if this is possible economically and financially. So you cannot have any relationship to export, to cost of production, except that if you reduce the price to a lower level, then most of those producers will be kicked out of the market, which we do not want to see.
Another somewhat different question. You said very little about the Soviet Union. Recently, the Soviet Union agreed to cut its output by 100,000 barrels per day. The first time they have done this. Why did they do that, and do you expect any future cooperation by them?
Well, I read that in the news, and I will have no illusion that the Soviet Union do have a vested interest in a higher price of oil. We all know that Russia gets 60% of the hard currencies they earn from the sales of oil, 13% from gas, 27% from gold, diamond, weapons, and everything else. Now, with the drop in the price of oil as it is, Russia is forced to go to the money market to borrow. And they did borrow so much. So it is in the interest of the Soviets to reduce 100, 200, 500,000 barrels a day in order to make more money. It's pure mathematics, simple mathematics.
There's a little bit more technical question, but our oil industry folks will appreciate your answer. Will Saudi Arabia continue its policy of netback pricing, and does the OPEC consider it a good policy for all its members?
We have a committee inside OPEC to study whether we continue with the netback or we phase out. And our objective is to go back to a fixed price if possible. And that's the Saudi objective. But let's wait and see what we can do together in OPEC.
I have so many questions on oil prices, but I think we've already answered most of those in either the presentation or the question going along. I think as a closing question that would give you an opportunity to at least a little bit to reflect on the process, I would hate to have you get away from this symposium without giving us a little insight into how oil policy develops in your own country. What is the process? I'm very familiar with the fractious process between Congress and the administration and the industry in this country, but I'd be interested in your description of how policy is made inside Saudi Arabia.
We play it by ear.
I anticipated several possible answers to that question, and that wasn't one of them. But I'm not at all surprised at the comprehensive sweep of the analysis, and I'm very grateful to His Excellency for this instruction today in the history of the market and how to think about it in the future. I thank you all for coming this afternoon, and I thank you very much for your talk. When the program ends, I hope you will take advantage of the exit to my right out these windows into the park. And the podium, we have another group coming a little bit later. Thank you again for coming, and thank you, Your Excellency.